Welcome to Deep Dive from Safewave, the place where we take these really complicated topics and try to break them down into something you can actually use. So today we're going to be diving into supply chain attacks. And to help us out, we've got this great piece from Search Security called "What is a Supply Chain Attack?" And these attacks can seem kind of like something out of a spy movie, but they're a real and growing threat.
Oh, absolutely. And what makes them so dangerous is the way they use trust against you. Instead of going after a company directly, they're going after the weaker links in the chain, like third-party vendors or suppliers.
So it's like instead of trying to break down the front door, they're sneaking in through an open window.
Exactly. They use how interconnected businesses are these days to their advantage. It's like a domino effect. They'll compromise a smaller vendor first, then use that access to hop to a bigger one and keep going until they get to their real target.
It's kind of scary to think about how many businesses rely on outside vendors for just about everything, from the software and hardware to even like HVAC systems.
And that's what makes it such a widespread problem. Any industry that depends on those outside partners is a potential target. You're talking financial institutions, government agencies, healthcare providers, they're all vulnerable.
Okay, so this is definitely something that everyone needs to be aware of. But let's move beyond just what it is and dig into how these attacks actually work. The article mentions this idea of island hopping, which you just talked about a little. Can you explain that a bit more?
Sure. So think of a really well-defended island that represents your main target. Attacking it head-on would be super difficult, right? But what if there are smaller, less secure islands nearby? Attackers can use those as stepping stones. They find weaknesses on one island, get a foothold, and then use that to move on to the next one. Eventually, they'll reach the island they were aiming for all along.
So they're going after those weaker links in the chain, like vendors who might not have the same level of cybersecurity as the bigger companies?
Exactly. And the methods they use to compromise those vendors can be really sophisticated. They might get into the software building tools to put malicious code in right from the start, or they could even mess with hardware components before they even get to the vendor.
So you're saying the malicious code could be hidden in something that seems totally normal, like a software update or even a piece of hardware?
Yeah.
That's pretty sneaky. And
Okay.
speaking of malicious code, the article mentions different types of malware that are often used in these attacks. Can you give us some examples?
Definitely. Things like worms, viruses, spyware, and Trojans. Each type of malware works in its own way and causes different kinds of damage. Like a Trojan might disguise itself as a legitimate program and trick someone into installing it. Once it's inside, it can create backdoors for the attackers, giving them access to steal information or disrupt operations.
I remember reading about an attack where a company was targeted through a software update for their network management tools. It seemed harmless, but it wasn't. And thousands of their clients were affected, even government agencies.
That's a perfect example of how a supply chain attack can have a ripple effect across a whole network. And what makes them so hard to catch is they often use trusted relationships. If you get a software update from a vendor you've been working with for years, you're probably not going to question it.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
It shows how important it is to not just trust blindly, but to really understand the security practices of your vendors.
For sure. And that's just one example. There was another case where a huge retailer got hacked through their HVAC system. Attackers found vulnerabilities in the HVAC software and used that to get into the retailer's network and steal sensitive customer data.
Wow, so these attacks can really come from anywhere. It's not just about protecting your computers, but also thinking about the security of all the connected systems and vendors that your business relies on.
Absolutely. The way modern businesses are connected creates a whole web of potential entry points for attackers. And as those connections grow, the attack surface grows too.
This is all starting to sound kind of overwhelming. Like, how can anyone stay ahead of all this?
That's a great question, and it's one that we're going to dive into more in the next part of our deep dive. We'll talk about some specific steps businesses can take to protect themselves and minimize their risk.
Okay, good. Because right now, I'm feeling like I need to go double check the security of every single vendor we work with.
I don't blame you. Being aware of the problem is the first step toward preventing it. But before we move on, I want to make it clear that we're not trying to scare anyone. We're giving you the knowledge you need to make smart decisions about your cybersecurity.
Right. It's about understanding the risks, but also understanding what you can do to protect yourself from them.
Exactly. And that's what we'll focus on next.
So stay with us, folks, for part 2 of our deep dive, where we'll move from understanding the problem to finding solutions. And if you're finding this conversation helpful, be sure to share it with your friends and colleagues. Let's all work together to raise awareness about this important issue. Welcome back to Deep Dive from Safewave. In the first part, we talked about how scary those supply chain attacks can be. The ones that take advantage of how connected all our businesses are these days. But now let's switch gears and talk about what we can actually do to protect ourselves. Because, yeah, the risks are out there, but we can definitely do something about it.
Exactly. There are a lot of things businesses can do to make their defenses stronger and be less vulnerable to these attacks. And it starts with understanding that security isn't just an IT problem, it's everyone's problem.
Hmm.
From the top executives to every single employee, we all need to work together to build a culture of security awareness.
Okay, so let's break that down. Where should companies even begin with something like that?
One of the best places to start is with a really thorough risk assessment of your whole supply chain. So figure out who your most important vendors are. The ones that if they got compromised, it would really mess things up. Then take a close look at their security practices. Don't just take their word for it. Ask to see their documentation, their certifications. Maybe even think about getting an independent security audit.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Hmm.
It's about going beyond just trusting them and really looking into how secure they actually are. And I'm guessing that same scrutiny should apply to the contracts you have with those vendors, right?
Absolutely. You want to make sure your contracts clearly spell out what's expected when it comes to security, who's responsible for what, and what happens if something goes wrong. Be specific about data protection standards, incident response protocols, even how data should be handled after the contract ends. These legal agreements can give you an extra layer of protection and make sure everyone's accountable.
So it's all about being proactive and setting those expectations right from the start. But what about things you can do internally? What can companies do within their own organizations to reduce these risks?
One important thing is to limit who can install software. The fewer people who have the power to install stuff from third parties, the harder it is for attackers to get in. You can also use strong access controls and multi-factor authentication to make it even harder for unauthorized people to get into your systems and data.
So basically, you're trying to make it as hard as possible for attackers to get in and move around your network.
Exactly. And while preventing attacks is the main goal, it's also important to be ready just in case one happens. That means having a solid incident response plan that specifically addresses what to do if one of your vendors gets compromised.
So you're not just talking about a plan for any cyber attack, but one that takes into account the unique challenges of a vendor being the source of the problem.
Right. Your plan should lay out exactly who does what, how everyone communicates, and what steps to take to fix things. It should also include how you're going to work with your vendors and any customers who might be affected.
It sounds like that level of preparedness is crucial, especially when you consider how quickly these attacks can spiral out of control.
Absolutely. And even though you can't completely eliminate the risk of a supply chain attack, you can definitely make yourself less vulnerable by putting these strategies in place and encouraging everyone to be vigilant.
So it's all about having multiple layers of protection, both within your own company and with all the partners you work with.
Exactly. And let's not forget about the human factor. Employee training is super important. You need to teach your staff about things like phishing scams and social engineering tactics and how to create strong passwords.
Because even if you have the best security technology out there, all it takes is one wrong click to open the door for an attack.
That's true. Human error is still one of the weakest links when it comes to cybersecurity.
It seems like the best approach is a multifaceted one, where you combine technology policies and education to create a really strong security posture.
Exactly. It's not a one-time fix. It's an ongoing process of evaluating, adapting, and staying alert.
Speaking of ongoing processes, are there any resources or frameworks out there that companies can use to stay ahead of the curve in this constantly changing threat landscape?
Oh, yeah. There are some great resources out there. Organizations like MITRE, they offer a ton of information on attack tactics and techniques, which helps companies build better defenses. And the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, they have a lot of guidance on cybersecurity best practices, including how to manage supply chain risk.
So it's all about staying informed, using the resources that are available, and constantly adjusting your security measures to keep up with the evolving threats.
Exactly. It's a journey, not a destination.
Well said. And on that note of continuous learning, do you have any final thoughts for our listeners as we wrap up this part of our deep dive?
I do. What's interesting? While technology is a huge part of defending against these attacks, it's not the only answer. The human element is still super important. We need to build a culture where everyone understands how important it is to protect sensitive data and knows how to do their part. If we think about the bigger picture, it's about creating a mindset of vigilance, not just within your own company, but with all of your partners.
That's a really insightful point. It's not just about having firewalls and all those fancy security systems. It's about creating what you could call a human firewall, where everyone is empowered to spot potential threats and report them.
Exactly. Encourage your employees to ask questions if something seems off, report any suspicious activity, and stay up to date on the latest security threats. Having everyone on board and aware can make a huge difference in stopping these attacks.
It's a good reminder that cybersecurity is a team effort, and we all have a responsibility to protect our businesses and our data. It's a good reminder that cybersecurity is a team effort. We all have a responsibility to protect our businesses and our data. And on that note of teamwork, I want to mention a fantastic resource for anyone who wants to stay in the loop about the latest cybersecurity trends and insights, the SafeWave newsletter on LinkedIn.
Oh, yeah. It's a really great way to stay up to date on those ever-changing threats and get practical advice on how to actually protect your business.
Absolutely. So if you're ready to level up your cybersecurity knowledge, be sure to subscribe to the SafeWave newsletter. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, I'd love to hear your final thoughts. What's one key takeaway you'd want our listeners to really think about as they navigate this whole complex world of supply chain security?
Hmm. You know what's really fascinating to me is that while technology is super important for defending against these attacks, it's not the whole story. The human element is still a huge factor. Building a culture of security awareness where every single employee knows how important it is to protect data and how to do their part. That's crucial. And if we take a step back and look at the bigger picture, it's about creating a mindset of vigilance, not just within your own company, but with all your partners too.
That's a powerful idea. It's not just about having firewalls and all those fancy systems. It's about creating almost like a human firewall where everyone can spot potential threats and report them.
Exactly. Encourage people to speak up if something seems off, report anything suspicious, stay informed about the latest threats. When everyone is aware and involved, it makes a huge difference in preventing these attacks.
It's a great reminder that we're all in this together. We need to work as a team to protect our businesses and our data. Well, this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive. We've explored, the dark side of how connected everything is these days and how sneaky those supply chain attacks can be. But we've also talked about how powerful knowledge awareness and proactive security measures can be.
It's been a pleasure sharing this information with you, and I hope our listeners feel empowered to go out there, take action, and strengthen their defenses.
I agree. And for those who want to dive even deeper into this topic, we encourage you to check out those resources we mentioned, connect with us on LinkedIn, and keep the conversation going.
Remember, the threats are always changing, so stay curious, stay informed.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive from SafeWave. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay informed, and stay safe.
Goodbye.